Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 114 Global Moral Issues. So, this go around, we're looking at how the relationship between morality and warfare actually has some implications for other sorts of political violence, the sorts of things that we usually talk about when we deal with issues of torture and terrorism, as well as just the applications of what happens in warfare and how we ought to conduct ourselves in all of this. So, what we're doing is effectively continuing our discussion from last time, but working in more concrete details rather than looking at the upper level question of how morality and warfare might relate to each other. Instead, we're looking at how that relationship shakes out in individual sorts of problems. So, what we're going to do today is look at a famous philosophical problem called the ticking time bomb scenario, all about, you guessed it, a ticking time bomb, as well as how that discussion and some of the issues in it can be informative for discussions of torture and terrorism. We'll also take a little bit of time to discuss the concept of a supreme emergency in just war theory and how plausible that sort of view is, and then end with our usual looking forward to the next unit. But before we get to any of our deep philosophical discussions, I want to start off with a story about like we have for the trolley problems and a couple of other situations. So, let's suppose that there is a movie thriller type villain who has decided to commit an act of terrorism against Purdue University in West Lafayette. And let's suppose that this person, who goes by the name of Johnny Evil Guy, just because if his mustache wasn't clue enough that this fellow is the exact sort of person you might worry about, Johnny Evil Guy has decided to plant an extremely powerful bomb somewhere on campus to inflict as much damage and suffering and misery as possible. However, it's really no good if a bomb just randomly goes off. Instead, Johnny really wants to inflict as much terror and as much suffering as he can prior to it going off. And so, while Johnny has gotten his hands on a very powerful nuclear device, one that's small yet strong enough to wipe out all of Lafayette, greater Lafayette, in one go, he's made it small enough to hide somewhere on campus. It's only about the size of a loaf of bread, and he's concealed it somewhere where he's pretty sure no one will find it. Additionally, he's set it up to where he doesn't have to be anywhere nearby for the thing to work. He's set it up to be on a timer. And so, having decided to inflict as much misery and cause fear and everything else, once he gets his bomb in place and gets the timer running, he actually informs people about the bomb and in fact gets captured, though this was not the original plan. He didn't intentionally give himself up. But once captured by the local FBI office, because of course there's one around here, wink wink. But once Johnny is picked up by the FBI, he refuses to tell them where the bomb is. He wants them to be nervous, he wants them to suffer, he wants them to be afraid, but he won't give up the location easily. And so, now we run into a problem. We have a bomb with a ticking clock attached to it. And given the size of it, and given how many nooks and crannies and little bits of things there are to Purdue University, there's just simply not enough time to search every nook and cranny of the university to find the bomb. Additionally, there's so many people in Lafayette, and let's say such a small amount of time to prepare before the bomb goes off, that there is no chance of evacuating everyone from the greater Lafayette area and getting them to a safe distance. So, even though Johnny Evil Guy has been caught, and we know about the bomb, we know about the attempted terrorist attack, we really face a bit of a challenge. What do we do in this situation? Now, thankfully, our law enforcement officers have some experience with this whole thing. They have a specially trained agent who has means of making people talk. And so, this particular FBI agent has the training necessary to torture Johnny Evil Guy, to inflict incredible suffering on him, to try and extract from him the location of the bomb. But given that this is morally questionable to say the least, there is a little bit of a question to be asked here. Should the FBI torture Johnny to try and find the bomb? Or should they do nothing and simply let it go off, maintain perhaps their moral dignity, but allow a couple 100,000 people to perish? Neither option seems appealing in the least. Obviously, letting people die is wrong, especially if you have the option to do something about it. Loss of life involved here is massive. But on the other hand, we generally assume that torture is wrong. It violates basic human rights. It also is just blatantly cruel and inhumane. It's barbaric in a lot of ways. So, we effectively have two options, and neither one looks good. If we want to break this down philosophically, we might start looking at two different lines of reasoning, asking about our situation here. On the one hand, we might think about this whole problem consequentially, or as a consequentialist, and torture Johnny to save lives. With this kind of justification, we're saying something like the end justifies the means. We're saying that the sheer numbers of lives that will be saved, the sheer amount of suffering that will be avoided, will justify whatever happens to Johnny in the next couple of hours. I mean, after all, he is a terrorist. I mean, just look at that top hat. I mean, definitely sinister guy, and it's written right in his name. We can even say that the FBI knows that Johnny is the one who planted the bomb. And so it seems almost like he deserves it to a certain extent. It's perhaps terrible, the things that that FBI agent might do to him, but it's going to be worth it at the end of the day, no matter how just intuitively monstrous and unappealing that whole option is. And overall, this is the more popular of our two lines of thought. It seems to be the one that most people, when asked about this situation, would take. But we generally don't feel very good about it. We still have this intuition, this general idea that it's just wrong to torture, that this is something that we shouldn't do. We might also start worrying about things like a slippery slope sort of situation. That if we start doing this sort of thing, it will become easier and easier for us to do it, and we'll do it in more and more circumstances. So there may be some longer term worries about doing this sort of thing. We might also just simply say that it's just flat out wrong to do. Uh, if we remember, a lot of us were not inclined to push the fat man in that situation. And there seem to be some similarities here. In the fat man version of the trolley problem, we have the option of pushing the fat man to his death in order to save 5 lives. But it seems wrong to push the fat man, no matter how many lives are saved. So we might wonder, why isn't it wrong to torture Johnny? Why do we afford more protection to the fat man in that situation than we do to the mustache twirling villain in this one? Is the number of lives? Is it the fact that he maybe deserves it? The point is that it's not very clear what we ought to do with this. We don't have things well worked out on this line of reasoning. But the opposite line of reasoning isn't very appealing either. And it's hard to dismiss as well. We could be non consequentialist about the whole thing and have a stricter and stronger view of human rights and moral principles and simply insist that it is wrong to torture another human being, regardless of what we might get out of it. For one, it violates Johnny's human rights. It's going to uh, sort of violate the moral dignity and standing of the person who does it. It might just simply violate a basic moral rule, if there are such things. And there are massive costs to this whole sort of move. For one, if we refuse to torture, then lives will be lost. And Lafayette will be obliterated. Additionally, if we refuse to torture, then we might wonder about the long term effects of it. We might wonder about what sort of justifications can we use. Like, what sort of story do you tell the family members? What sort of policy, what sort of example does that set? What sort of things does it invite of future attacks and things? So, this other option similarly seems difficult to justify, but it also has some valuable insights and intuitive appeal to it. Most people consider this second stance to be implausible when considering the problem, but we can't just entirely or easily reject it. Now, here's why we talk about this. Here's why I bring the whole thing up. Regardless of what we pick, even if we decide to torture Johnny, there are still moral issues at play in the whole situation. Like, even if we take the seemingly more appealing answer, the one that statistically has more people argue in favor of it, even if we go that route, there are questions and problems surrounding this whole thing. There are moral implications for how we act in these tough and difficult situations. For one, there is a lot of parallels between how we act in a ticking time bomb scenario and how we might act in warfare. The stakes are high in both situations, and lives are at stake. But the way we act in one should presumably have implications for how we act in the other. If it's not okay to inflict undue harm on enemy soldiers who are trying to kill you, then why is it justified in the case of this terrorist, this Johnny Evil guy that we're worried about? Uh, for one of our authors, Alan Dershowitz, points out that additionally, when we try and figure out what to do in these types of situations and what sort of implications that it might have, we also have to worry about the difference in how we carry out torture and worries and things like this. Dershowitz points out that there's a difference in impact and implication between torturing someone legally and openly using a warrant and officers of the law and having had a trial and whatever else it might be necessary, and then doing it beneath the table and secretly and closed. Oh, excuse me. Don't know what's up today. But Dershowitz points out that both of these options have different moral implications and long term impacts on us as a society. So even if out of the options for dealing with Johnny, even if we take the supposedly more appealing one, we've got further questions and things to work out. For one, Dershowitz thinks that following a full on legal procedure is going to be far preferable to simply keeping it a closed and private matter that we tortured Johnny, sort of sweep it under the rug if we could. For one, if we do things above board and legally, we might avoid some of the slippery slope worries. Uh, we are able to establish more clear precedents and rules and procedures and whatever else for when we as a society allow torture. And he believes that doing this sort of thing legally and openly will also allow for less overall torture. If we as a society have to be explicit that we do actually do this sort of thing, there's going to be a lot of public backlash to it. There's going to be a lot of disapproval, and there's going to be a lot of discussion about the whole thing. It might end up resulting in there being far clearer restrictions and limits on it than if we try and do this sort of thing secretly and clandestinely and pretend that it never happened. But the bigger worry, I think, is that if we deal with things like the ticking time bomb scenario, and we have these questions on whether or not we are morally okay with torture, this has implications for how we deal with political violence in general, how we deal with things like terrorism, and how we deal with maintaining our moral integrity. See, generally speaking, it seems pretty safe to say that terrorism and political violence like it, as opposed to organized warfare between nations, is always morally wrong. The definition that our textbook uses for terrorism is similar to that of the US State Department, and it lines out terrorism as intentional violence against non combatants for political or ideological purposes. So, if you recall from the readings that you did for this last lecture and some of the discussions that we talked about, this very obviously is going to violate everything that we might believe about permissible political violence and warfare, if there are such things. In the last lecture, we talked about two different perspectives on the idea that morality applies to warfare, that there are actual restrictions that apply to what we do in war. We talked about how even broad versions of pacifism don't really seem to work, and that instead moderate versions are more appealing, but that those moderate versions look an awful lot like just war theory. And the idea that morality doesn't apply to war, that is, realism about warfare, that this view doesn't seem to be very consistent, that it allows for normative oughts and shoulds and things that seem to imply that there's room for morality to apply. So, if morality applies to warfare, and if some form of just war theory is true, then that means that there are limits and restrictions on the kinds of things that we do in warfare. And one of the most basic of these, one of the most common worries that we have on conducting warfare, is that innocents don't get hurt any more than they have to. Because it seems to be, to a certain degree, unavoidable that non combatants or innocent people get harmed in the process of committing warfare. It's why pacifism has as many arguments for it as it does. But if that's the case, then terrorism, just by definition, seems to be right out as a possible morally permissible thing. Like, obviously, it's illegal by every nation that matters. But as a matter of morality, it seems as though it could never be justified because, by definition, it requires attacking non combatants, that is, innocent citizens who have nothing to do with warfare, intentionally, and doing so to further some political or ideological purpose. But if we adopt some form of realism, or if we adopt some version of just war theory, that is, if one of these positions is true and we think that it's true, then we run the risk of actually being forced by reason and not being a hypocrite to accept that terrorism is permissible, according to Stephen Nathanson. See, the problem is that if we look at something like the ticking time bomb scenario and whether or not it's permissible to torture Johnny Evil Guy, if we say that it's all right to throw some of these restrictions out in order to save as many lives as possible, that is, to do something that furthers one of our own goals, those situations and conditions might be the same sorts of ones that terrorists are citing for committing their acts. And again, I'm not trying to get political about this. I know the US has a very complicated history with terrorism and with occasionally being overzealous in its worries about this sort of thing. But the way that we're focusing on it, terrorism as the intentional attacking of non combatants, of innocent people for political purposes, this sort of thing seems to be something that we've got a vested interest in wanting to not be included in our moral theory. Or to put it another way, if our moral theory allows terrorism, we probably have a kind of screwed up moral theory. So this is something that could be a very negative implication for whatever view we're looking at. It's just perhaps a simply implausible view. And so if the justifications that we use in the case of torture lead to this sort of thing, this can be a significant argument against those sorts of views and what that means for torture. Terrorism and torture are two subjects that inform each other very, very much. If we wanted to boil this down to a simpler slogan, If we are willing to violate human rights in order to survive or in order to accomplish some goal, like say to save lives in the ticking time bomb case, then we now have a philosophical challenge of figuring out why is it not okay for others to do the same, to violate human rights to further their goals. And explaining this and making sense of it is something that we as ethicists ought to do. Now, let's take this a little bit more slowly, follow our authors, and see where this whole thing goes. Now, the main reason that we end up condemning terrorism, the main reason why this is something that cannot plausibly be defended on a moral theory, by the definition that we're using anyway, is that it intentionally harms civilians and other non-combatants. We didn't talk about the various conditions of the jus in bello, but our textbook does. Uh, and the jus in bello in general, this concept in just war theory, essentially argues that there are some things that you simply don't do in warfare, that it is not morally permissible to simply do whatever you like whenever you're involved in warfare. And one of the things that the jus in bello forbids is intentionally harming non combatants or attacking disproportionately to your goal and the forces that you're fighting. So, in other words, it's not okay to attack innocents on purpose. And furthermore, it's not okay to do drastic overkill simply to accomplish your goal. Now, these two principles, these issues, are the main reasons why we condemn terrorism. Terrorists intentionally attack civilians, and furthermore, they do generally dramatically harmful things for rather disproportionately smaller goals. Things like awareness of a cause or trying to simply scare people or inflict damage on an economy or an area or a group's morale. These kinds of purposes are not the sorts of things that massive violence supports. And we might have worries about these same sorts of things happening in war as well. When we criticize terrorists for attacking civilians, we run the risk of making ourselves hypocrites. Because in previous engagements, or in probably in current ones, they're just not as well publicized, uh, our nations, the United States in particular, have committed some acts that really come quite close, if not actually do, violate these same moral principles, the jus in bello and these uh, restrictions, these duties not to harm civilians. One of the best examples of this sort of thing is the bombing of Germany during World War II by Britain. Michael Walzer and a number of other just war theorists discuss these kinds of issues. Walzer, who argues for a just war theory, as we saw with the last lecture, discusses World War II in the context of finding it somewhat worrying that the Allies did, in fact, intentionally attack civilian centers during World War II, trying to survive and carry on in the midst of the attacks on Britain. But Walzer and a few other theorists essentially argued that there was actually a difference between those attacks on civilians and the kinds of attacks on civilians that we see today via terrorism. You see, Walzer argued that, for one, we can draw a distinction between intending and foreseeing the deaths of innocents, just like we saw in the previous reading. That intuitively we want to draw this kind of distinction, and in war it does seem to be practical to do so. But also in the case of bombing cities, we might make a distinction between what Walzer calls a supreme emergency and normal situations. See, Walzer in general is an advocate for just war theory. In general, he advocates for the idea of there being restrictions on what is permissible in warfare. But Walzer also believes and argues for the idea that there are some situations that are so drastic, that constitute such an emergency for a civilization or a nation that they actually justify suspending the rules of combat, what he calls a supreme emergency, and this provides an exception to non combatant immunity. See, essentially, a supreme emergency is a case when a single nation is faced with the threat of enslavement or extermination. And when faced with this kind of threat, that nation can temporarily override the rights of innocent people in order to survive. And Walzer sees this sort of thing as going on for Great Britain during World War II. During the bombing of Britain, during the Battle of Britain, the British people were under such attack by Nazi Germany and under threat of extinction or enslavement or both that Britain was actually justified in attacking civilian centers in Germany for at least a short time. Now, Walzer thinks that this exception passed by the time 1942 rolled around. That is, Walzer does not believe in a permanent exception to this sort of thing. It's a very temporary state. But Walzer does think that this is a plausible thing, that in some situations things get bad enough that we can set aside the normal rules of combat, the normal rules of morality, in order for a group to survive. Our author, though, Nathanson, rejects this idea. Nathanson points out that the conditions that were developed for supreme emergencies by other authors, namely that attacking non-combatants be a last resort, it's an act of self-defense, it's a reply against a genocidal, racist oppressor, and so on, the other conditions, that this same sort of situation is the exact same sort of thing that terrorists claim is going on with them. Some people have said or used the phrase, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. That from the other perspective, that from the terrorist perspective, they're not terrorists. They're desperate in fighting for their survival, for their very way of life, against a massively stronger opponent. I'm not trying to necessarily advocate for this position, but it does show that there may be an inconsistency in some of our moral rules when we talk about these types of subjects. If the same sort of conditions apply, it seems irrational and inconsistent of us to say that it's acceptable for us to violate non combatant immunity. That is, it's hypocritical of us to violate the rights of innocent people in our situations, and yet almost automatically condemn the acts of terrorism as being immoral instead, and that they don't fit the same description. And the other sort of the other sort of solution for this sort of thing, appealing to the doctrine of double effect, this idea that we should distinguish between intended harm and foreseen harm, that this really doesn't help. That this kind of distinction that a lot of people want to reach for when discussing issues of jus in bello, that it's simply too vague and too imprecise to actually really help draw distinctions between allowing terrorism and, I'm sort of talking myself into a corner here, but the point is that appealing to this kind of idea doesn't actually help solve our worries here about terrorism and attacking civilians and so on. So, to pause and recap for just a moment. Generally speaking, we like to think that in some situations it might be all right to suspend the rules of morality for political violence. And we see this with like the ticking time bomb scenario and dealing with terrorists. In that kind of situation, we want to say that it's okay to suspend the rules because things are bad enough, things are desperate enough. But if we allow that kind of justification, we run the risk of allowing something that we really don't want to allow, morally speaking, namely terrorism, the intentional attacking of non-combatants for political reasons. It's something that we generally think is just utterly implausible as being morally permissible. But explaining why it's okay in some situations and why it's not okay in others to do this sort of thing is difficult. Nathanson says we can't use the supreme emergency objection. The conditions simply don't provide enough basis for us to allow one and forbid the other and be rationally consistent. Furthermore, if we try and distinguish between the acts of terrorists and our own actions by looking at something like the doctrine of double effect, or this distinction between intending harm and merely anticipating harm, this sort of thing just doesn't work. Terrorists, for example, might claim, like, if we want to start pushing on this idea, oh, well, you were trying to harm civilians, whereas it was just an accidental byproduct of what we did. Terrorists might still claim something like, well, really, we just meant to blow up the building. It was an accident that the actual people got hurt. We weren't trying to harm anyone in particular. This seems like something that could plausibly be said and argued for, and there would be little basis for denying it. Arguing things based on supposed intention just seems to be a very flimsy way of trying to distinguish the morally permissible from the morally impermissible, according to Nathanson. Instead, Nathanson proposes a different sort of solution, adding an additional requirement to the jus in bello. That is, adding an additional requirement to the rules of what's allowed in the case of political violence. The main issue, as we've said before, is harming civilians and violating human rights. In the cases of torture and those sorts of situations, we run the risk of saying, well, if it's okay for us to torture, then it's also going to, also as a matter of rational implication, must be all right for acts of terrorism to be committed, which is obviously false, or at least most of us want to say so. If that's the case, then we might try and distinguish between intentionally harming civilians versus merely accidentally doing so. If that's the main issue, merely foreseeing the harming of civilians isn't enough to show that there's a difference between one set of actions and the other. Nathanson proposes, along with a few others, that we shouldn't simply use some of the tests that we've looked at in previous lectures for determining intent. Instead, significant positive steps need to be taken to avoid harming noncombatants. Nathanson uses the phrase that armed forces ought to bend over backwards, so to speak, to protect civilians and try and minimize casualties. That is, if we're going to distinguish between good intentions, or if we're going to distinguish between intending harm and merely foreseeing harm, one way to prove that you don't actually intend harm is to go out of your way to intentionally try and minimize civilian casualties. And this seems to give some sort of a reasoned basis for distinguishing between terrorist attacks and permissible warfare. If much of the worry is that, well, civilians might be harmed in this process, and we need to be consistent in saying that this sort of thing is all right as part of just war theory, and that acts of terrorism still are not all right, adding this additional requirement to just war theory and to the jus in bello seems to do some of the trick. It seems to insist that, well, more is being done to try and protect civilians, that this truly isn't something that's being intended. And as a matter of intuition and general moral theory, that seems to be at least far more permissible than the intentional harming of civilians that terrorism requires. And so Nathanson seems to give some sort of a solution to this worry on how we can be consistent in our forbidding the violating of human rights. But it's worth asking whether this sort of train of thought works. It's worth asking and worth checking to see whether this argument really makes any sense. The problem certainly exists. If we use one set of justifications to allow violating human rights, then it seems as though that set of justifications should apply equally and objectively. This is simply how we do ethics. And doing that may run the risk of allowing terrorism to a certain degree. On the flip side, if we don't allow this sort of act, then we're forced to say that the only right solution to the ticking time bomb problem is to allow people to die and to not torture Johnny Evil Guy. And that situation seems also unacceptable. But hey, at least rationally and consistently, we would be able to forbid, we'd be able to rationally and consistently forbid terrorists from doing their things, morally speaking. But if we do want to try and avoid the inconsistency with the first choice, then we need some sort of a ground for distinguishing between the two. But it's worth asking whether or not Nathanson's solution, whether or not doing things on the basis of extra positive steps to protect civilians, whether that's enough, whether that's enough of a basis for distinguishing the accidental allowing of civilian deaths and accidentally violating people's rights. And accidental is maybe the wrong word. Or merely foreseen is the more accurate way of talking about all this. I guess really I'm just sort of talking around the idea that Nathanson's solution may not be enough. It may not be the case that this is enough to distinguish one set of intentions from the other. We might also just generally question whether distinguishing between intended harm and foreseen harm is a legitimate distinction in the first place. There are a number of ethicists that would reject this sort of idea, that say that really there is no difference. And so once again, we're faced with that worry of consistency, that worry of justifying our own actions, but forbidding those that we find distasteful and doing so without rational basis, which again is not the way that we try and do ethics. So even though there are arguments laid out for this sort of thing, it's worth taking the time to see whether or not they work and see whether or not they're actual valid solutions to the kind of stuff that we're addressing. And really, that's about all we've got as far as looking at problems for just war theory. In general, we haven't provided necessarily clear solutions to our problems, but we looked at some of the aspects of things that come up in discussions of morality and warfare. The general questions of whether or not morality and warfare are related to each other and whether one applies to the other. These are questions that we need to know about. And some of the aspects of those problems, namely things like being consistent in our moral principles, knowing whether or not warfare is a special sort of exception to normal human activity, whether violence is always inherently wrong, or whether we have to allow or whether we ought to allow for exceptions to it in the case of self-defense or national self-defense, worrying about whether or not there ought to be restrictions on torture and activities in warfare and how we can be consistent on those, whether it's worth or whether we need to draw a distinction between intending and foreseeing harm. These are aspects of the problem that are worth talking about and worth looking at. These are things that it's worth really considering and thinking about whenever we try and decide questions having to do with morality and warfare. Now, in the future, we're going to do the same sort of process with environmental ethics. We're going to start looking at questions and issues having to do with the environment rather than warfare. So the next unit's all about an entirely different set of questions. In particular, we're going to be looking at the idea and the question of what sort of beings deserve consideration in our moral thinking. So once again, we'll look at a few different essays that talk about some of the different positions and maybe how they fit together. And we'll highlight some different aspects of moral thinking about these problems, in particular about the environment. We'll take a look at some stuff by Aldo Leopold on whether or not the environment itself deserves moral consideration, whether plants and trees and hills and so on deserve moral rights and consideration. We'll look at things having to do with animal ethics. We'll look at whether or not animals deserve moral status and true, full consideration in our moral thinking. And we'll look at some objections to these ideas. So things may be a little bit clearer this next go around how the different positions fit together, partly because, well, Warfare is just a messy subject and always has been. But it's also worth pointing out that in this next unit, that we're also going to be doing our midterm during all of this. Yes, we have had enough material for a midterm by the time you've gotten to the end of the next unit. So make sure as you move forward that you keep an eye on your workload. Don't forget to give yourself enough time to do both the ordinary material and to actually spend some time on the midterm and give it your full amount of thought. If you haven't already, take a look at the second journal for this unit and the quiz if you haven't done it yet. Remember that the journals are all about self-reflection or just completion grades, whereas the quiz is a test of making sure you're keeping up on your vocab. You're actually understanding the basic concepts that we're talking about. If you have any questions on any of this stuff, or if you want to just discuss it a little bit further and maybe try and clarify a few things, feel free to reach out. Maybe through conversation or email, we can fix things up. I'm always more than happy to help in any way that I can. And in the meantime, hope your semester is going great and happy thinking.